It's a huge pleasure to be back at MONREPOS and a huge honor to be the new patron, especially in succession to Professor Eibel Eibelsfeld, who, as we've heard, passed away sadly this year. I met him only a few times, and I vividly recall his boyish charm, his immense enthusiasm for our subject, our collective subject, and his kindness. I had dinner in his house with a group of other people, and I was really impressed by the way he spoke English and German kind of alternately, as though out of courtesy to his English-speaking guests, but also giving them a little lesson in German at the same time. It was very gracious, it was beautifully done, very charmingly done. As it happened, during that dinner, the news came through from Jane Goodall of warfare in chimpanzees in Gombe Stream. And Irenaeus Eibel Eibelsfeld was beside himself with excitement. He said, "Das ist fantastisch, fantastisch." He was overjoyed with this news, and it was very, very exciting to be in his presence at the time. I was also delighted to hear from Sabine just now that Stephen Fry had nominated Steve Pinker as the English-speaking world's prime public intellectual, because I had said exactly the same thing in the tweet which Lutz just put up. So I'm doubly pleased to have chimed in with another great hero, Stephen Fry, and saying Steve Pinker is indeed our prime, our number one public intellectual in the English-speaking world. He is wonderfully readable as he introduces non-specialist readers to his own specialist subject. But what's truly remarkable is that he does it for several different subjects. Unlike a typical science journalist, he's a world-class expert in all the subjects he writes about. However different they may be, his scholarship is as deep as his writing style is gripping. I blush to admit that the first time I heard of him, he was described to me as the Richard Dawkins of linguistics. I read The Language Instinct, Der Sprachinstinct, and was immediately extremely gratified by the comparison. I would love to be called the Steven Pinker of anything. And he has gone on to become the Steven Pinker of so much else. For of course he didn't stop at linguistics. Our understanding of the evolutionary roots of human psychology will never be the same again after How the Mind Works. Wie Denken im Gehirn entsteht. Every page of this magnificent book gives the mind something to work on. Steve raises the game of the reader. He doesn't just inform the reader, he stimulates us to have stimulating thoughts of our own. One particular point occurs to me: emergent properties. The mental skills that our ancestors needed for planning a hunt, for example, would need no additional hardware to be pressed into software service to do any task that requires logic, deduction, induction, hypothesis testing. Just as electronic computers designed to do calculations need no further hardware in order to play chess or run an airline timetable or design clothes or something. Maybe the recursive, hierarchically nested software evolved eventually to do language, but evolved previously to do planning of behavioral operations such as hunting forays, and was thus automatically available to be pressed into service, to be sequestered as language grammar when language came along. Steve is courageous. He doesn't hang back from controversy, and he's made himself unpopular in circles that should know better. His book, The Blank Slate, Das unbeschriebene Blatt, burst into a culture where many social scientists had an attitude to genes we might satirize like this. I suppose we'd reluctantly have to admit that genes exist, but we suspect them of being nasty fascist things, in which they'd all just go away and leave us to do our social science the way we always have, without having to learn any genetics. The blank slate takes a mercilessly critical look at the whole question of nativism versus environmentalism. I'd always regarded Shakespeare's nature or nurture dichotomy as rather a dull topic. Yet The Blank Slate is a thoroughly entertaining book. It takes a pinker to achieve that feat. In Words and Rules, Wörter und Regeln, Steve returned to language. He uses the clever technique of zeroing in on such details as regular and irregular verbs and zooming out to illuminate, well, how the mind works. After achieving so much, you might have expected him to rest on his very considerable laurels. Now that I think about it, a laurel wreath would look quite becoming on the famous coiffeur. By the way, Steve's one of the few people, I'm one of the others, who's had their complete genome sequenced. And one of the genes they found in Steve's genome was one for being completely bald. But anyway, resting on his laurels was exactly what Steve did not do. He went on to produce what can only be described as magnum opus. And Lutz has already made allusion to it. The better angels of our nature. He moved into a completely new field, namely history, including archaeology. It is a magisterial work of history, but unmistakably at the same time, the work of a scientist, and a scientist at the very height of his powers. The Better Angels of Our Nature, Gewalt, is not just a scholarly tour de force. It's a document of hope and optimism. Hope and optimism are much needed today, of course, and that very fact should make us suspicious of anyone who steps up to offer them. But our suspicion is battered into submission by the sheer weight of scholarship. And if weight of scholarship suggests heavy going, that's exactly wrong. The book is light and easy reading, good company, witty, and amusing, like its author. Any normal public intellectual might have been satisfied with one magnum opus. But Steve's 2018 work, Enlightenment Now, Aufklärung jetzt, bids fair to be his most important book yet. At a time of almost universal pessimism, like Better Angels, it gives us a more cheerful view of our human predicament, looking not through rose-tinted, but realism-tinted spectacles. The realism comes from deep knowledge of our human roots in forming a shrewd and penetrating acquaintance with modernity. As you've already seen from Lutz's slide, I think it's high time the Nobel Prize for Literature was awarded to a writer on scientific themes. The nearest precedent is probably Henri Bergson, regarded as a scientist in his own time, although his penchant for mysticism would disqualify him today, at least I hope so. His belief that life was powered by a mysterious élan vital was memorably satirized by Julian Huxley's attribution of the movement of a railway train to élan locomotif. Steven Pinker would have no truck with such obscurantist nonsense. He's a true scientist. If my dream of a scientist winning the Nobel Prize for Literature is ever realized, I cannot think of a truer or more worthy candidate than him. And it will be nice to think the Human Roots Award got there first. Steven Pinker, I'm delighted to present to you the Human Roots Award of 2018.